Hello and welcome back to another episode. Consider giving us a like and please subscribe to the channel. Let's get started.
A storm had been gathering, its fury relentlessly crashing over London, the wind howling as if it were echoing hidden secrets, and the rain relentlessly battering the windows of 2-1B Baker Street. Inside, the warm glow of a gas lamp softly lit the room where Holmes and Watson were deep in their own pursuits. Holmes, leaning back in his chair with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, was lost in thought, staring at the ceiling, though the answer to a complex problem was written there. Watson, more focused on practical matters, was absorbed in a medical journal, his glasses precariously perched on his nose. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed ominously, marking the late hour, yet neither man seemed ready to retire. Then, the silence of the night was shattered by a sudden and frantic knock at the door. Holmes's eyes flickered with a spark of curiosity, and Watson, accustomed to such interruptions, sighed resignedly as he set his journal aside. "I'll get it," he muttered, unfolding himself from his chair. Though not surprised by the late visit, he had become used to the unusual, often mysterious nature of their visitors at Baker Street. Opening the door, Watson was confronted by a woman whose appearance exuded both urgency and high status. Her hair, elegantly styled but somewhat dishevelled by the wind, and her wide, fearful eyes, revealed a mix of fear and determination. She looked at Watson with an intensity that conveyed her desperate need for Holmes's assistance. "Dr. Watson," she said, her voice trembling slightly from the cold, or perhaps from fear. "I must speak with Mr. Holmes immediately. It's of the utmost urgency." "Please come in," Watson said, stepping aside. He led her into the sitting room, where Holmes was now sitting upright, fully attentive. The woman paused for a moment to compose herself, smoothing her skirt before sitting down. She turned to Holmes, who was watching her with a calculating gaze. "My name is Lady Eleanor Pembroke," she began, her voice gaining steadiness. "I find myself in a most distressing situation, and I am at my wit's end." Holmes gave a brief nod for her to continue, his calm demeanour showing that he was fully engaged. "Tonight," Lady Pembroke said, "a package was delivered to my estate. It was left at the door, with no courier in sight. Inside was a clock, a large, ornate table clock encased in crimson and gold. Along with it was a note that read, 'Time runs out at the 11th hour.'" Watson felt a chill as she spoke, and Holmes's interest visibly piqued. "And this clock?" Holmes asked. "Did it function?" "Yes," Lady Pembroke replied. "At precisely midnight, it struck 11 times, even though the hour was 12. The sound was not just the usual chime of a clock. It was haunting, almost foreboding. It filled the house with dread." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, his mind clearly racing through the implications. Was there anything else unusual about the delivery or the clock itself? Lady Pembroke hesitated before leaning forward, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves might listen. "The servants are terrified. They speak of an old family legend, a curse placed on a 17th century ancestor involved in dark deeds. They believe the clock is a sign of doom, a signal that old feuds and misfortunes are being revived." Holmes steepled his fingers, his eyes glinting with excitement. "And what do you believe, Lady Pembroke?" "I don't know what to think, Mr. Holmes," she admitted. "I am a rational woman, but the fear this object has instilled in my household is palpable. I need your help to solve this mystery." Holmes rose from his chair, his eyes sharp with decision. "We will visit Pembroke Manor first thing tomorrow morning. This case seems to involve not just the physical, but the psychological and perhaps even something supernatural." Watson, intrigued by the psychological aspects of the case, nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," Lady Pembroke said, a trace of relief in her voice. "I feel a great weight lifted, knowing you are on the case." As she left, the storm outside seemed to momentarily subside, as though even the elements were pausing in anticipation of the investigation ahead. Holmes returned to his chair, already lost in thought, while Watson, preparing for the chilling adventure to come, knew this case would be as enigmatic it was eerie. Upon arrival, they were greeted by the butler, a solemn man named Mr. Higgins, who led them through the grand hallways to the drawing room where Lady Pembroke awaited. She appeared slightly more composed than the previous night, but still troubled. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she greeted them, her voice echoing in the grand room. "Thank you for coming so swiftly. I have something else to tell you." Lady Pembroke's voice trembled slightly as she spoke again, adding to the urgency of the situation. "There is more, Mr. Holmes. Last night, after our meeting, one of the servants, a young footman named Michael, disappeared. He was last seen heading toward the servants' quarters, but by morning, he was gone. None of the other staff have seen him since. His disappearance, coupled with this mysterious delivery, is deeply troubling." Holmes raised an eyebrow, silently prompting her to go on. "Indeed," he said, already piecing together the details, "was Michael in any way unusual? Any grievances or strange behavior before he vanished?" Lady Pembroke shook her head. "Not at all, Mr. Holmes. Michael was a loyal and cheerful young man, well liked by everyone. His sudden disappearance has left us all in confusion and fear." Holmes considered this carefully, then rose from his chair. "If you permit me, Lady Pembroke, I would like to examine the clock first and then speak with some of the staff." "Of course," she replied, and with a nod to the butler, Mr. Higgins led them to the study where the infamous crimson clock stood on the mantelpiece. The clock's ornate design, its gleaming red finish, and delicate golden filigree stood out dramatically in the dim light, its beauty almost overshadowed by its sinister aura. Holmes approached it slowly, his eyes scanning every detail before reaching out to touch it. "Notice this, Watson," Holmes said, pointing to the back of the clock. "There are signs of tampering here, and look, traces of mercury, a substance rarely found in regular household clocks. What do you make of this?" Watson leaned in to examine it. "Mercury. That could be used to alter the sound of the chimes, perhaps to give them that eerie, almost supernatural quality Lady Pembroke described." "Precisely," Holmes replied, his mind racing. "This clock is no ordinary timepiece. It's central to our mystery." As he continued to investigate, Holmes opened a small compartment in the back of the clock and discovered a vial of mercury, further confirming his suspicions. "It appears someone went to great lengths to ensure this clock not only marks time, but does so with ominous intent." After returning to the drawing room, Holmes asked to speak with the staff. One by one, he questioned the household servants. All spoke highly of the missing footman, Michael, and none could offer any explanations for the strange delivery of the clock. None of them knew anything about its origins either. When the interviews concluded, Holmes and Watson withdrew to confer. "What strikes me as most odd," Holmes said, "is not just Michael's disappearance, but the sheer fear among the staff. They speak of curses and doom as if these things are as real to them as the air they breathe. Do you think there's any truth to their fears, Watson? Could this curse be more than just superstition?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I have yet to encounter a curse that cannot be explained rationally, Watson. But the fear itself is real, and it can be a powerful force. They say fear is a kind of magic. It clouds the mind and makes one see things that aren't there. So our task is to break this spell of fear, then," Watson said, "to restore reason to Pembroke Manor." "Exactly," Holmes agreed. "Our first step is to trace the origins of this clock. That may lead us to the missing footman and to the heart of this mystery." As night fell over Pembroke Manor, an eerie calm settled over the grand house. Holmes and Watson, deciding it was wise to stay overnight, were shown to their guest rooms overlooking the vast, shadowy gardens. While Watson found comfort in the warmth of the room after the day's investigations, Holmes seemed restless, his mind still tangled in the complexities of the case. Before they retired for the night, they shared a quiet dinner with Lady Pembroke. The meal was punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance, heightening the tension in the air. Afterward, Holmes suggested a walk through the manor to digest the meal, but Watson knew better. It was simply another opportunity for Holmes to investigate further. As they wandered through the dim hallways, Watson noticed the way the flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. Suddenly, Holmes stopped, tilting his head slightly, as if listening for something beyond ordinary hearing. "Do you hear that, Watson?" he whispered. Watson strained to listen, and after a moment, he too heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like scraping and tapping, coming from the end of the corridor. Without a word, Holmes motioned for Watson to follow, and they moved toward the sound. But as they approached, the noise abruptly stopped. They found themselves in front of the library. Holmes carefully opened the door, but the room was empty, with only the curtains fluttering from the night breeze. "We seem to have lost whatever it was," Watson remarked, a note of disappointment in his voice. "On the contrary, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes scanning the room. "It has only just begun to reveal itself." They stood in silence, the tension thick in the air. After a few minutes, a soft thud echoed from within the room. Holmes moved swiftly toward the sound, his step silent. Watson watched as Holmes approached a large bookcase, his fingers moving deftly over the wooden frame. Suddenly, Holmes pressed a nearly invisible lever, and the bookcase swung open, revealing a narrow hidden passage. "Ah, what have we here?" Holmes murmured. Holmes whispered, his face alight with the thrill of discovery, as he and Watson stepped into the hidden passage, guided only by the light of a single candle. The air grew cooler, and the walls seemed to close in around them as they ventured deeper, finally emerging into a small secret room. The space was cluttered with old ledgers, maps, and scattered documents, as though someone had been rifling through them recently. "This appears to be a hidden study, or perhaps a place for safekeeping," Holmes remarked, examining the room's contents. "Someone in this house is keeping secrets." As they searched further, Watson noticed a newer piece of parchment, its message hastily written in an almost frantic hand. He picked it up and read aloud, "You cannot turn back the hands of fate." He handed the note to Holmes. Holmes scanned the note, his eyes narrowing. This message, combined with our earlier encounter, suggests that someone within these walls is orchestrating the fear surrounding the Pembroke curse. They continued to search the room, but found little else of immediate value. As they made their way back to the main manor, Holmes was deep in thought, piecing together the clues they had uncovered. "We've uncovered something, Watson," Holmes finally said as they reached the corridor. "This is more than just a family curse or a ghostly apparition. We've stumbled upon a conspiracy linking the past to the present." With this new lead, they returned to their rooms, the weight of their findings settling in. They knew the shadows of Pembroke Manor held more than mere darkness. They held the key to unraveling the mystery. The next morning, after a quiet and somewhat tense breakfast with Lady Pembroke, Holmes and Watson revisited the hidden room. The daylight did little to ease the room's secretive atmosphere. The walls were lined with ledgers and dust-covered scrolls, relics of a bygone era. Holmes began inspecting the room more thoroughly, taking note of each ledger and letter, occasionally muttering to himself or jotting down observations. Watson, less adept at reading the old handwriting, focused on the maps and portraits on the walls. While examining them, he uncovered a framed genealogy chart tucked behind an old painting of the Pembroke estate. The chart detailed the family lineage, with notes scribbled in the margins. "Holmes, look at this," Watson exclaimed, pointing to the chart. "It seems the Pembrokes have been entwined with another family, the Redferns, for generations." Holmes joined Watson and studied the chart. "The Redferns? Yes. I remember seeing a reference to them in one of the ledgers. It appears there was an ongoing feud, a dispute over inheritance," Holmes observed. He turned back to a stack of letters he had been perusing and selected one, handing it to Watson. "This letter, from about 200 years ago, mentions a betrayal that led to a blood debt. The Redferns vowed to repay it. It seems this long-standing feud might be more than just history. It could explain the curse and the crimson clock. Holmes paused, pacing the room, deep in thought. If the Redferns are still seeking revenge, it could account for the recent events at Pembroke Manor. Watson raised an eyebrow. Do you think a feud that old could really carry on to the present day? Holmes stopped pacing and looked at Watson seriously. Never underestimate the power of a family grudge, Watson. It can simmer beneath the surface for generations, only to flare up when the conditions are right. With this new hypothesis in mind, Holmes proposed a plan to investigate the Redfern connection further. We need to gather more information on the Redferns. If they're behind this, we should find evidence linking them to the clock and perhaps to Michael's disappearance. They spent the rest of the morning compiling a list of names, dates, and contacts who might provide insights into the current status of the Redfern family. By midday, they had their next steps planned out. Holmes decided to send telegrams to his informants in London to gather any available information on the Redferns. Meanwhile, they would return to the staff and ask more direct questions about recent interactions with the Redfern family or any unusual visitors to the manor. As they left the secret room, Holmes paused by the door. This case, Watson, intertwines the past with the present in ways we rarely see. We aren't simply uncovering theft or malice, but perhaps the dark heart of a century-old vendetta. With a determined nod, Watson followed Holmes out, aware that the day ahead would either bring them closer to a resolution or pull them deeper into the tangled legacy of the Pembrokes and Redferns. As dusk fell over Pembroke Manor, Holmes and Watson continued their inquiries. They had spent the afternoon speaking with the household staff again, this time focusing on any connections to the Redferns or unusual visitors. The staff remained tight-lipped, either out of fear or loyalty, but their unease was evident, adding to the sense of danger in the air. On their way back to the house from the stables, where they had been questioning the coachman about recent deliveries and visitors, Watson spotted a figure in the distance. The man, cloaked and moving cautiously in the shadows of the garden, seemed to be heading toward the manor's back entrance. "Holmes, look," Watson whispered urgently, pointing to the mysterious figure. Holmes's gaze sharpened as he watched the cloaked man. "Quickly, Watson. We mustn't lose him. The figure might hold the key to solving the entire mystery." They quickened their pace, their steps soft on the earth, as they closed in on the man, who seemed to sense they were following and began to move faster. His cloak swirled behind him as he picked up speed. Despite their best efforts to remain silent, a twig snapped beneath Watson's foot, causing the figure to break into a run. A chase began, with Holmes and Watson weaving through the garden's winding paths, the man's silhouette just ahead of them. The pursuit led them to a dense grove of trees at the edge of the estate, where the man's cloak caught on a branch, slowing him down. This momentary delay allowed Holmes and Watson to close the gap. Just as they were about to catch him, the man turned and hurled something toward them, a small glass sphere filled with smoke. It shattered on the ground, releasing a thick fog that disoriented them. Coughing and struggling to wave the smoke away, they heard the rustling of leaves as the man made his escape. When the smoke cleared, Holmes knelt down to examine the remnants of the glass sphere. "Phosphorus," he murmured, recognizing the substance. "Clever," he added, scanning the ground for any other clues. Though the smoke screen had thwarted their pursuit, it wasn't entirely fruitless. At the spot where the man had been momentarily snagged by the branch, Holmes found a torn piece of fabric from the cloak. "It's weave distinct. Not a common fabric," he said, holding it up to the fading light. "This could help us identify our mysterious visitor." As they made their way back to the manor, Holmes was deep in thought. The timing of this man's appearance, just as we are exploring the Redfern connection, is highly suspicious. Whoever he is, he's clearly concerned about our investigation. "Watson, still catching his breath from the chase, nodded. Could he be a Redfern? Possibly, or at least connected to them, Holmes mused. This cloak fragment and the smoke bomb suggest a level of preparation and resourcefulness, indicating that whoever he is, the stakes are high. Back at the manor, Holmes sent a message to his tailor in London, enclosing the fabric sample. If this cloak was tailored, my contact may be able to trace where it was made. It's a long shot, but every clue counts. That evening, as Holmes and Watson were discussing their next moves, another troubling development added to the mystery. The butler arrived with a new message, found pinned to the manor's front door. The note read, "Time is a weapon. Beware the 11th hour." It was unsigned, but carried the same foreboding tone as the previous messages. "The plot thickens," Holmes remarked dryly as he studied the note. "Our adversary is bold, and the message is clear. We're running out of time. We must act quickly." Watson felt a shiver run down his spine as he considered the meaning of the note. The 11th hour was approaching, and with it, perhaps a resolution good or bad to the mystery of Pembroke Manor. The following morning, Holmes and Watson travelled to the village near Pembroke Manor to follow up on the lead from the fabric. Holmes was unusually quiet, absorbed in thought, as they walked. Upon reaching the village, their first stop was the local tailor, whom Holmes questioned about the fabric. The tailor, a meticulous man, confirmed that the fabric was rare, imported from France, and sold to only a few in the area. "Do you recall who purchased this fabric?" Holmes asked, his tone insistent yet polite. The tailor flipped through his records, and then replied, "Ah, yes. A gentleman by the name of Mr. Alfred Redfern. He requested a cloak made from this very fabric a few months ago." Holmes and Watson exchanged a meaningful look. The Redfern connection was becoming increasingly undeniable. "Thank you. You've been most helpful," Holmes said as they left the shop. Outside, Holmes paused and glanced at the busy street. "Our next move is to visit the local chemist. The phosphorus used in the smoke bomb must have come from somewhere, and in a small village like this, there can't be many sources for such chemicals." They entered the chemist's shop, the doorbell ringing as they did. A balding man with spectacles perched on his nose greeted them. Holmes wasted no time giving the chemist a sketch of the glass sphere and describing the chemicals involved. The chemist nodded, recognizing the description. "Yes, I recall selling phosphorus and a few other chemicals to a man interested in experimenting with alchemy. He mentioned recreating historical experiments. Do you know his name or anything else about him?" Holmes asked, his sharp eyes fixed on the chemist. "He never gave his name, sir, but he was well-spoken and had the bearing of a gentleman. Quite secretive about his work. He came in here about a fortnight ago." Holmes thanked the chemist and stepped outside, his mind processing the new information. "Alchemy," he murmured. "Our mysterious figure has an interest in ancient sciences." This aligned strangely with the nature of the feud based on historical grievances. They decided to visit the local library to research any alchemical practices in the area that might tie into the Pembrokes or the Redferns. The librarian, intrigued by their inquiry, directed them to a collection of local historical records. As Holmes and Watson pored over the dusty tomes, Holmes's finger suddenly stopped on a page. "Watson, look at this," Holmes said, pointing to an old text, a manuscript detailing a notorious alchemist, known to have ties to the Redfern family in the 17th century, described experiments with time perception and fear-inducing concoctions. "This is enlightening," Holmes mused. "Our adversary uses the cloak and phosphorus to spread fear, much like an alchemist of old would use his potions to awe and terrorize." Watson, studying the manuscript, added, "It seems this feud and its methods are rooted in much older traditions than we first realized." Armed with this new knowledge, Holmes and Watson returned to Pembroke Manor to confront Lady Pembroke with their findings. They found her in the drawing-room, looking more anxious than ever. "Lady Pembroke, we've uncovered significant connections between the Redferns and ancient alchemical practices," Holmes began, outlining their discoveries. "It appears the current events may be the result of this deep-rooted legacy." Lady Pembroke listened intently, her face pale. "What can we do, Mr. Holmes? How do we stop this from escalating further?" Holmes's expression was serious, yet resolute. "Tonight, we must catch our alchemist in the act. We'll set a trap, and with your help, we will end this once and for all." As dusk fell over Pembroke Manor, Holmes, Watson, and a determined Lady Pembroke prepared for what they hoped would be the final chapter in the haunting drama that had gripped the estate. The atmosphere at the manor was tense, as nightfall cast long shadows across the ornate halls and fading portraits. In the study, Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Lady Pembroke gathered to finalize their plans for the evening. Holmes had devised a precise strategy, every detail meticulously arranged. "As the clock nears 11, I suspect our elusive alchemist will make his move," Holmes explained, his eyes sharp and focused. "He seems to thrive on the symbolic power of time, and the 11th hour has been a recurring theme his messages." Lady Pembroke nodded, her expression firm yet anxious. "What do you require of me, Mr. Holmes?" "You must be the bait, Lady Pembroke," Holmes said gently, aware of the gravity of his request. "Act as if tonight is like any other, retiring to your room at the usual hour. Watson and I will be hiding, ready to apprehend the suspect when he reveals himself." Lady Pembroke agreed, her courage steeled by the desire to put an end to the threats haunting her family. With the plan set, Watson checked his revolver, while Holmes reviewed their positions within the manor. The hands of the clock moved steadily toward 11, and the house settled into an uneasy silence. Holmes and Watson concealed themselves in nearby rooms, with a clear view of the hallway leading to Lady Pembroke's bedroom, where they anticipated the confrontation would take place. Minutes passed, each second stretching into eternity, until the distant chimes of the clock resonated throughout the silent manor. The haunting tones of the 11th strike had barely faded when a subtle sound, a faint creak of a floorboard, alerted them to the approach of someone. Peering from his hiding spot, Holmes saw a shadowy figure cloaked in dark fabric, moving cautiously toward Lady Pembroke's room. As the figure reached the door and gently turned the handle, Holmes and Watson sprang into action. "Stay where you are," Holmes commanded, his voice calm but firm. The figure froze, caught off guard, and slowly turned to face them. The light revealed his features. It was Mr. Alfred Redfern, his face a mix of shock and defiance. Holmes stepped forward, his stance unyielding. "Mr. Redfern, I presume we've been expecting you." Redfern's composure faltered, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "Holmes, you don't understand," he began, his voice tinged with desperation. "This has always been about justice, about righting a wrong so old that it has poisoned generations." Holmes listened carefully, but remained skeptical. "And you chose to seek justice through fear and manipulation. There are lawful ways to resolve disputes, Mr. Redfern." Redfern shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "The law has never favored us ever, since the Pembrokes betrayed our ancestors. This was the only way to make them feel the depth of our suffering." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "And what of the young footman, Michael? Was he just a casualty of your vendetta?" Regret flashed across Redfern's face. "He discovered my identity by accident. I had no choice but to detain him. He's unharmed, I assure you." With Redfern's confession, Watson moved quickly to secure him, while Holmes contacted the local constabulary to retrieve Michael and take Redfern into custody. As the ordeal came to a close, Lady Pembroke entered the hallway, relief washing over her face. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot thank you enough. Tonight, you have lifted a terrible burden from Pembroke Manor." Holmes gave her a reassuring nod. "It is our duty, Lady Pembroke." Justice, truth, and peace must always prevail over shadows and fear. With Redfern in custody and the mystery resolved, the manor slowly began to return to normal. Yet the echoes of the past would linger for a while longer, a reminder of the deep-seated grievances that had nearly torn the estate apart. Having resolved the case, Holmes and Watson prepared to return to London, their bond strengthened by another journey into the darker realms of human history and emotion. The morning light poured through the windows of Pembroke Manor, casting gentle patterns on the floors and walls, and warming the faces of those gathered in the drawing room. Lady Pembroke, Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. John Watson sat, sipping tea, reflecting on the events of the previous night. The local police had taken Mr. Redfern into custody, and young Michael had been found safe, though understandably shaken by his ordeal. Holmes broke the morning silence. He was locked in an old cellar once used for wine storage. Fortunately, he's unharmed, and will soon return to his duties, should he choose to. Lady Pembroke sighed, a mix of relief and sorrow on her face. It is comforting to know the matter is resolved, but it is tragic that such bitterness within a family led to this. Mr. Holmes, how can I ever thank you? Holmes waved away her gratitude with a modest gesture. It's all in a day's work for us, Lady Pembroke. However, ensuring that such a feud does not arise again might be something to consider. Watson nodded in agreement. Perhaps this is an opportunity for reconciliation, or at least a truce between the remaining members of the Pembroke and Redfern families. Yes, I believe you're right, Dr. Watson, Lady Pembroke replied thoughtfully. I must find a way to extend an olive branch to the Redferns. Despite everything, it's what my ancestors should have done long ago. Holmes looked pleased with her response. A wise decision, Lady Pembroke. It's often these old wounds left untreated that create the monsters we later fear the most. With the formalities winding down, Holmes and Watson prepared to leave Pembroke Manor. As they gathered their belongings, Holmes paused by the crimson clock that had marked the start of the turmoil. He studied it for a moment, contemplative. An interesting object, Watson, Holmes remarked, but I believe the manor would be better off without it. It might be wise to remove it before it becomes a symbol of fear once more. Lady Pembroke agreed and instructed the butler to store the clock in the attic, where it might eventually be forgotten. As they stepped outside, the fresh country air seemed to cleanse the last traces of the mystery they had unraveled. Holmes inhaled deeply, looking out toward the horizon. The human psyche is much like these rolling hills, Watson. There are valleys and peaks, hidden views and obvious ones. Our job is often to navigate these landscapes, bringing clarity to the obscured sights. Watson smiled, mentally recording the moment for later retelling. And what a navigation it's been, Holmes. From a mysterious crimson clock to a centuries-old family feud. Yes, indeed, Holmes said, as they walked toward the carriage that would take them back to London. And let us hope our next adventure is as stimulating, but perhaps a little less ominous. With that, the carriage rolled away from Pembroke Manor, leaving behind the shadows of the past, now dispelled by the light of truth and reconciliation. Watson glanced back once, thinking about the manuscript of their adventures. He would soon pen this case, with its emotional depth and dramatic resolution, as a testament to the enduring partnership between Sherlock Holmes and himself, and to their ongoing quest to illuminate the darkest mysteries. Join Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson as they unravel a web of aristocratic secrets and deception, racing against time to thwart a cunning adversary bent on reviving a deadly legacy. Will the legendary duo prevent the clock from striking a fatal hour? Stay tuned as the mystery unfolds, revealing that in the world of Sherlock Holmes, not everything is as it seems.